Hello, everyone. This is Jason White, and welcome to our 14th ISO podcast. We received a very positive response to our most recent podcast with Derek Daly, and today we bring you another very special guest. This gentleman won the 1977 European SuperV Championship and the 1984 US SuperV Championship. He made his Indy Car debut in the 1980s, and he eventually proved to be one of the best oval track racers of his era, scoring two Indy 500 victories, the first with Doug Shearon in 1990 and the second with Treadway Racing in 1997. He holds the current IMS 1-lap and 4-lap qualifying track records set during the 96 500 time trials. He also captured wins in the 12 Hours of Sebring and the 24 Hours of Daytona. More recently, he's worked as an Indy Car race steward, and he's been a mentor to current driver and fellow countryman Rinus VeeKay. We're really thrilled to have him on the podcast today, and we're looking forward to his insights. Please welcome the Flying Dutchman, Arie Luyendyk. Arie, thanks so much for making the time for us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks a lot for having me.
While we're on that subject, actually, the Flying Dutchman, a very dynamic nickname. When was the first time you were aware of that nickname, and is it a nickname that you embrace?
Not really so much because it's such a they do it with every Dutch person that, my dad was called the Flying Dutchman when he was racing. And then, of course, now Verstappen is called the Flying Dutchman. But every guy in the Netherlands who has done anything significant on four wheels or on two wheels, like in motorcycles or, let's say, bicycle racing, they call him the Flying Dutchman. So it's kind of a really old expression that is way overused. But they did call me that, and at the time it was appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely, for the average speed of the race when you won, for sure. Well, we really hope you've been having a good summer. What have you been up to recently?
I've been extremely busy doing fun things and also going to, which I consider still fun most of the time, being a race steward for Indy Car racing. And I'm a race steward in race control together with Max Papis. And I'd like to explain to the listeners how the race control situation works, because a lot of people will go on the internet and go like to me or to Max, like, why did you throw the red flag, or why did you do this? Well, the race director, who is a guy by the name of Kyle Novak, who is very good to work with, and I think he's very professional. He's the one that is in charge of throwing the red flag, throwing the full course yellow, making sure the safety vehicles go to where they have to go to help a guy who just, had an accident. Giving the blue flags, directing the corner workers to throw a yellow or withdraw the yellow or a blue flag. There's a lot of moving parts up in race control. And the thing that Max and I do as race stewards, we look strictly at on-track behavior of the drivers, if they follow the rules or not. And that could be, the thing we are busiest with is usually blocking, if they block or not, avoidable contact, how that transpired, if we go back a few corners before and we go like, okay, how did this lead up to a contact in turn 7? So we go back to turn 1 or 2 and we just follow them and go like, okay, so this is what was happening. And so contact, avoidable contact, blocking, also contact in the pits, unsafe releases in the pits, and then IndyCar, every car in the field has a pit tech. That pit tech will call in up to race control and say, hey, car 5 just ran, or car 6, 7, 8, doesn't matter which car, ran over an air hose or over an air gun, and we have to look at that. And all the teams are in contact with race control through messaging. So the guy on the pit stand, he can message race control, and then we look at those messages. Sometimes a driver will call out, hey, car so-and-so blocked me in turn 5, have a look at that. So we look at that and go like, yeah, that was a legitimate block, and then we'll put it under review.
Yeah, it's a very complex job, obviously. And I think I've heard you said it before in another interview, where you're never going to be right for everybody. Somebody's going to be disappointed with the ruling, and that's just something I guess you have to get used to.
Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of temperament do you think it takes to make a really, really good steward?
Well, Max Pappas and I have now, this is our ninth year together.
Yeah.
And we've also evolved in how we do things. And now we have more data. And the data is really helpful for us. But we felt kind of in the beginning like we have to do this really quick. And then I go like, no, we need to calm down. We just need to take it step by step. And sometimes you have 4 incidents within the first lap, right? Well, you got to go one by one. You got to finish them off, and that's why sometimes after the restart, let's say there was a crash on the opening lap, after the restart, you might have like 7, 8 minutes later where the guy gets a penalty or not.
Mhm.
That is because we have to go through all these different separate incidents to then come to a conclusion on what to do. So we've gotten, let's put it that way, a lot calmer. We've taken our time more, but therefore sometimes the calls seem a little bit late as far as penalizing or not.
Yeah, but you want to get it right. I'd wager that with being a steward, you'd much rather be late with a call than wrong with a call. That comes quicker.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
so important for us to do the right thing. And so there's a lot of anxiety sometimes because we don't want to take away the potential for a guy to win, let's say, the Indy 500. Um, so we really have to do our homework and take our time. We have come now to the point where we get a message from the pit tech, but we do want to verify it with video. If we cannot verify it with video, we're not going to penalize. When you run over a air hose and the air hose just moves a couple of inches, there's no penalty. Used to be like that in the early 2000s and through 2011 and 12. But Max and I changed that. We only give a penalty for somebody running over his hose. If the hose goes flying, the air gun goes flying through the air, it hits somebody, it endangers people, then we give a penalty.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot of work to do, obviously, and we're really grateful for the work that you and Max put in, because it certainly does contribute to the great racing we're seeing right now. So that's great.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're involved with that. And of course, everybody knows you as a two-time Indy 500 champion, the fastest 500 qualifier in history. But let's go back for a minute to your native Holland and the beginning and everything. Your father, Jaap Luyendyk, he made a name for himself both on two wheels and four. According to you, he was racing bicycles all over the Netherlands and in France and Belgium. Tell us about your father and his influence that he had on you and your own aspirations to become a racing driver.
Yeah, I mean, so around the dinner table, it was only racing that was ever discussed, and bicycle racing at one point too, I guess. But um, my parents loved sports. So my mom used to watch ice skate racing, the Tour de France, you name it. She was watching everything. And but mainly racing, came to the order at the dinner table. And um, when I was in the Netherlands back then, you could only race once you've gotten your driver's license, and you can only start um, the school driver ed when you're 18. So I would turn 18, I did driver ed, got my license, which wasn't easy to get there, but I got it the first time out, luckily. And then my dad suggested, you know what, let's do this school at Zandvoort, the racetrack in Holland. It's to improve your driving skills. It had nothing to do with racing, but just to improve your driving skills. So I did that. And then we're talking, and my brother-in-law had bought a Formula V to do the racing driving school with. And then we were talking around, and my dad said, "Well, why don't you guys just share that car? Fair was his name. He'll drive in the morning, and you drive in the afternoon." So that was the plan. That's what we did. And then the plan changed because my dad used to buy and sell Formula V cars. So we had one there that he bought to sell, but he said, "Well, why don't you just use that to do the school with?" And that's how I started, and I did the school. And It went great. It went well. I was pretty quick, and I was, you know, really excited about the fact that, man, this is something that I think I can do. And that's how it kind of started. And then I got my license to race. And then in 72, I did my first Formula V. So you had Formula V back then, and you had Super V. Formula V is a 1300cc engine, smaller race car, slower. And I did my first season in Formula V 1300 in the same races my dad drove. And that year he won the Western European Formula V Championship, which is a championship for England, the Netherlands, Belgium, I think, and France was part of that, the Western zone, they called it. And my dad was extremely quick, and he wasn't the best coach, unfortunately. Um, if I had understeer or the car was pushing in the corner, he would say, "Well, you just got to throw it in really hard, and the back end will come around." I go, "Okay, that's the way to do it." So, um, but it was definitely memorable driving with him in the same races. In fact, we led races together. Our cars were painted identical. We had the same sponsor.
Hmm.
His sponsor came on board as my sponsor once I showed some speed. They said, well, let's see how Junior does it. And if he goes well, then we'll sponsor him. And that's what they did. And so we were leading races together, and that was super cool.
You had a brief stint in European Formula 3, but then you ultimately decided to move your career to the United States. Tell us about that decision. Like, what were the key reasons for your move to the States, and were there other possibilities you were considering at the time?
Well, as always, it's always about having the money, the budget to do the next step. So I was driving in Formula 3, and I had my first season, 78. I mean, I had some good results, but I didn't win races. But the second year was really, it was make or break. Well, I was running up front, but usually we broke down or we had problems with tires, and those were the days that I was racing against guys like Alain Prost, Genzani, Baldi, um, Jerry Boutsen, a lot of guys that made it to Formula One eventually, Stefan Johansson, Nigel Mansell, all those guys we were racing against back then. So I had the speed, I didn't have the results. I won one race. And after 79, we couldn't come up and find money to go to Formula 2, which would have been the next step. And then I went back to driving Super V again. So I was always in and out of the Super V series for a long time. And the opportunity arose to do a race in Phoenix by invitation by Volkswagen.
Mhm.
And I accepted the invitation, and I did the race in Phoenix at the end of 1980. And I saw the Indy Cars drive for the first time on an oval. And I thought that was super impressive. And I go like, yeah, I think I'm going to come over here and see if I can race here. So I did that one race. I finished sixth in the Super V. There was a team owner by the name of Wilbur Bunce, fantastic guy. He came over to me after the race and he said, I kind of like the way you drove for your first oval. Do you want to drive for me next year? And I raced Super V in 1981. And that was my start in the US.
Yeah, having won two championships in Super V, one in Europe and one in the US, was there something about Super V that really you clicked with? Because you seemed to do really well. Was it the power? Were it the cars, or some other factor? You think?
No, the Super V was very identical to Formula 3. Like in 79, I drove Formula 3 and I did a bunch of Super V races. And in fact, Zandvoort, my home track, I was quicker in the Super V by a couple of tenths than the Formula 3. They were almost identical type of cars. And yeah, I mean, those are just the cars that, that will bring you up the ladder to go to
Mhm.
either Formula 1 or now here, Super V. I mean, IndyCar. And I mean, there was a point where I go like, oh man, I got to drive Super V again because I literally started driving for the first time in a Super V in 75, and I was still racing Super V in 84. So, I mean, that's a long time to be in a feeder series. But if you don't have money to go up to the next ladder, you're kind of stuck, or you quit racing, or which I nearly did, but I just stuck with it because I wanted to keep on racing.
Yeah, and in 1985, you had your first full Indy Car season. I think you had one start in '84, right? But you did a full season in '85. This really gave you your first taste of top level American open wheel
Yeah.
oval racing, and you did very well in your first 500 at Indy. You finished seventh, and you took Rookie of the Year honors. What were your impressions of IndyCar oval racing back then? And was there any inkling at the time that, this is something that might suit me particularly well?
Well, initially I was almost like afraid to tackle that new experience because I had seen the crashes that had happened to people, and I'd seen the the bad injuries that people like, Rick Mears had, um, Jim Crawford. I mean, I had seen, well, Jim Crawford was later, but I mean, there were a lot of guys with leg injuries and feet injuries, ankles. And so when I went to Indy for the first time and started practicing and did my rookie test, we had this small team, small Provimi team, and we had one car. We didn't have a backup car. And I just took it super careful. I was very careful. I took no risk because I knew that A, I could get hurt, and B, we only had one car. So I really worked up to it and slowly and slowly. And to make a long story short, I survived the whole month of May. I got to the race, and the same thing there. I built it up and built it up. And by the last third of the race, the last quarter, I got into such a nice rhythm and the car felt good. And I remember this thought going flashing through my mind. I'll never forget. I thought to myself, I really like this. That was my thought. And it was just a nice rhythm going, and my speeds were good, and I ended up finishing seventh in that race. And I was super happy with that performance. And I also got over the fear a little bit because the car was quite good at the end of the race. Um, but I always had in the back of my mind that the crashes were going to be big, and I didn't want one. I always make a joke like I like to have my coffee when I come home.
Mhm.
So I always made sure that I would come home to my coffee. But when I coached guys later, like quite a few guys, like Charlie Kimball, um, for instance, um, Alex Lloyd, who else did I coach? Ryan Briscoe. I always told these guys, you gotta want it. You gotta want it and you gotta like it. Make sure you get up in the morning and you look forward to getting in the car because you just like to go fast at Indy. And I think that's a big mental, hurdle that you have in your head. You don't want to be blocked by fear.
Mhm. Yeah, I can see that. Then eventually, your career started to pick up some steam when you got to racing with Hemmelgarn in 1987, and then Dick Simon for 2 years, 88, 89. Uh, what were the working relationships like with those two really respected car owners?
Hamilton was a great team. It was all centered around myself, and then occasionally we had other drivers in there like Rich Vogler, and for Indy only. Um, but that all came to, I was working with Larry Curry, who at the time was a very respected uh, crew chief, but he also had a good role as far as setting up the car. Um, Tim Wardrop, who's a great engineer, was working with me in '87, and we had a lot of good results that year. Our engines were a little down on power compared to other guys, other teams. But the car was reliable. The team was good. We had good people working on the car. One of my, the crew chief was Kim Green. Kim Green, who now is a promoter of several of the IndyCar races like Toronto, Mid Ohio, and one more I forget. But Kim was a great mechanic. He was a brother of Barry Green, who uh, ran the Foresight team, and owned it later. Cool Green was the team back then. So, but I really have to say, once I started driving for Dick Simon was very good at setting up a car on the oval. Driving with Dick Simon and doing what we did in that car, like in Portland, like in Milwaukee and Indianapolis. I knew then after doing races with him and performing so well, I knew like, yeah, I can win the Indy 500 if everything comes together well. And it did in 1990.
Yeah. 1990, you moved over to Doug Shearson Racing, which was based in Adrian, Michigan, I believe.
Yeah.
And this was a team that had employed a lot of very talented drivers over the years. Danny Sullivan, Alonso Jr., and right up to that point when you came along, Raul Boesel. Um, Leading up to Indy in 1990, was there any sense that you had of like, boy, this team is really primed for success, or was it just kind of a slow boil building to race day?
Yeah.
How was that month of May for you guys?
The month of May was terrific, but the
Yeah.
races before not. So when I went to Indy, I didn't have that feeling like, oh, we could go there and win. But then we started practicing. And then I'm like, oh, wait a minute. We're good because from day one we were fast. And then as we went through the first week, we were practicing and improving the car and fine tuning it. And the car was just always really good. And it didn't matter if it was a hot day or a cold day or if it was windy or not. The car was just always there. And that led me to qualify third on the front row. But the way the car was handling the whole month and the way we were working together, I literally felt on Sunday morning I could win that race. So I didn't go into that race hoping to win it. I was going into the race thinking I could win it.
Yeah, and it was a very interesting race day. There weren't many yellows, which accounts for how quick it was to a degree.
Yeah.
Also, a lot of the teams that people were considering to be favorites had a lot of difficulty getting a handle on the track. The blistering of tires was a big
Yeah.
story. People were having to make extra pit stops. But in the midst of all of this turmoil, you and the number 30 came up to the top of the pylon. Now, when you look back on that race, what really made, I mean, you mentioned that the car was very good all month, but during the race, what were you and your Lola able to do that your pursuers were unable to do?
Well, in the beginning, I developed quite a bit of push with the car understeer, so we had to make the front end turn in better, and we did that in like the first three pit stops. We were adding some more wing, and I was playing with the roll bars in the car, and then we just hit that sweet spot to where I was running faster than I qualified,
Mm.
which was on the front row. So that tells you something. And the track was quite hot that day, and I had experienced very small blisters on my tires um, after I had passed Bobby Rahal for the lead. And then we put that last set of tires on, and all of a sudden I was not able to run 221 or 222. I was running 216, 217, 18, but Bobby Rahal was running slower than that. So that still gave me that cushion that I had, the 10-second cushion. But I really was struggling a little bit on that last stint compared to earlier in the race. And it turned out that that last set of mine also had blisters. I couldn't see them in my mirror, but they did affect the handling.
Mhm.
Um, Luckily for me, Ray Hall didn't all of a sudden pick up the pace and do 220s like he also had done before. So it ended well. But yeah, so of course, Emerson was killing it. He was really going away with the race and he was leading the most laps. And Emerson, when he came in for his pit stop, he came in right away afterwards again with blisters. So he lost a lap.
Mhm.
But Emerson for sure was the quickest guy that day, but it probably contributed to him having those blisters. And I think the same happened with Alonso Jr. So it was a matter of survival. And I think in the end, we had the least amount of blistering of all these guys that did have it. So I don't think Bobby had blistering. He might have had a little bit. I don't know about that. But yeah, it all came together, of course, back then. And I don't want to downplay my win because the win was amazing and fantastic. But back then, you had the privileged teams that had the Chevy Ilmore. And then you had the other teams that simply couldn't get it. So you had half the field that just could not get the engine with the best horsepower, which was the Chevy Ilmor. And Newman Haas had it, Penske team had it. But like that day too, Rick Mears was struggling with his handling. Danny had a big crash in the beginning, but Danny was not really a factor in that race anyway. But he did have a big crash and didn't finish. And I don't know who else was driving for Penske that day. I don't know if he had 3 cars or just 2. But you definitely had the first half of the field that had all the right equipment, and the second half of the field that did not.
Yeah, because I remember in the last laps of that race, I think it's Sam Posey who says that they mentioned one of the big factors that put the team where it was they finally got that Chevrolet engine.
Yeah, it definitely was a game changer, and you had to have that engine to win the race. So when I signed for Shearon, it was being discussed that he would get that engine, and then once they announced it, I actually said somewhere like, if I don't win races now, I might as well retire, because but of course it's not always about the engine. You got to have the handling work for you as well. At Indy, it all has to come together, but the engine definitely helped.
Um, then in 1991, an interesting situation occurred where the Shearon team was bought by Bob Tezak, and it ended up merging with Granite Telly's team.
Yeah,
And so now you're driving the iconic Dayglow red, STP colored,
hmm,
even though they weren't sponsored by STP, but it's an iconic color
yeah,
for Granite Telly, and that was a very, very potent one-car team. You had a legit shot at winning back-to-back 500s. You've ultimately finished third. But the thing that most people remember about that year is all the difficulty the team had finding sponsorship, and then there was an ownership conflict that occurred later on. And of course, this is all out of your control. You're just trying to
yeah,
drive the car. Uh, and despite all these distractions, you still won two races for them that year, both ovals, and then you were second at Michigan, could possibly have won. In your opinion, if the team had been in a better situation financially and politically, what else do you think could have been achieved in 1991? Because there
yeah.
was such talent there and such synergy there that you could just see it.
Yeah, we had great people on the team. I mean, Vince ran a really tight ship. Vince Granite Telly passed away, unfortunately, a couple of years
Yes.
ago of COVID. And Mo Nunn was the engineer. And we all know what Mo Nunn can do.
Mhm.
And Peter Parrott was running the team. He had been working for Penske for many years. We had this amazing group of people. We have guys on the team then. The crew chief for Alex Palou this year was on my car in 1991, Rick. And so we have amazing talent at that team, and the financial troubles we had, um, and the fact that we could not continue in '92 was a really disappointment because that team would have just become better and better and better. And it was unfortunate that that happened because when Bob Tezak bought the team from Doug Shearson, Bob Tezak drained the team of any financial resources it had for his own whatever he did with it, flying around in jets and you name it. In 1990 was the biggest disappointment for me was we win the 500. After that, we test 1/2 day at Mid Ohio, and we never test again. And we're always chasing the facts, and we're never competitive. To the point where people were saying, "Well, oh, that 500 was a fluke." But luckily, I was able to, because I didn't know where this was going to go, with Tezak owning the old Domino's team, because Domino's was now pulled out. And Vince called me. He said, "Do you can you put me in touch with Tezak? Was there's something there we might be able to do together." And I was so happy that Vince did that. Called me because Vince then worked together with Tezak to continue the team under the leadership of Vince Granite Telly, and that was my saving grace for '91. And like you said, I mean, we could have won the 500, but we had a spark plug go bad, and I had to make a pit stop, and I went down a lap, and I was never able to get that lap back. But I finished third, a lap behind Michael and Rick Mears. But there was there was a chance to win the 500 again. We were very competitive that year, and it was just, in my opinion, the best car and the best prepared car I ever drove.
And one of the best looking cars too. It made the jobs of the play-by-play people very easy. They could see you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that color.
Yeah.
Yeah, Vince always thought, he said, yeah, if people see in the mirror, then at least they'll just get out of the way because they can see you so good. I said, well, they don't just get out of the way, but they will see me.
Mhm. Yep, that's true. Then you moved on to race with Chip Ganassi, excuse me. You had two 500-mile starts within the 92, and that led to the full-time drive in 93. On paper, this looked like a great matchup.
Yeah, it
And for
was.
what
Yeah.
and for whatever reason, the results just didn't come. Looking back, what do you think could have been done to make that team gel a bit better? Because it certainly was a
Uh,
great combo.
yeah. So they had run Eddie Cheever in 1990, 91 as well, and 92. And they were not able to win any races with Eddie, which was surprising because Eddie is a great road course driver, and he should have won on a road course. I think he had a couple of podiums. Um, on the ovals, obviously he didn't have the experience, but as he got more, he became, a really good oval driver. But um, the car had an inherent problem with the geometry that you could argue, well, Newman Haas didn't have it. Well, Newman Haas used to have Newman Haas. They were really working under a conflict of interest because they were also the Lola importer. And anytime Lola came with an update, they would get it. Nobody else would get it. And then you were always running after the facts. In our case, long story short, the car just didn't handle good for me until we made a significant change to the suspension. From that moment on, we were super competitive, and that was started in Mid Ohio, and then Nazareth. The last race of the year, I finished third behind two Penske's. We had the speed, but it came about 10 or 12 races too late. And at Indy, although I had the pole, we missed on the setup in the race. Uh, Finish second sounds really good, but that was a struggle to finish second.
Yeah.
That was one of the hardest races I did mentally. Back then, it was so funny. The rules were so different. Like, you could literally throw a new set of tires on the car every pit stop, right? And you could use as many tires as you wanted in the month of May. Now they all have regulated so many sets of tires. But back then, there was a guy, a PR guy working on the team, and I had a restart on new tires, and I made up like 3 positions on the restart. I was always pretty good at, you know, getting the most out of restarts. And so I said on the radio, I said, we need more new tires in case we have another restart or another pit stop, right? New tires, because as soon as the newness was gone, the car kind of went bad and started to sliding a bit. So then he literally, the PR guy, took our wheels with used tires, went to another team, got their new tires, the team that had dropped out, and got new tires from them to put on our wheels. I mean,
Okay.
you could do that back then.
Yeah.
So we had one more restart where we had a pit stop, and I made up another 2 or 3 positions. And Emerson was the last guy that I almost got. I literally was halfway next to him into turn 3, and I just couldn't get him on that restart. And it turns out that it was between us in the end. But once he got in front of me, once he was in front on the last restart, the restart where we both passed Nigel Mansell, I got close to him, and the car wiggled a bit and was sliding, and then I just had to settle for second.
Well, a few years later, 95, you had a very unique opportunity to possibly win a second 500 when you drove for John Menard. And that's a very different kettle of fish than what you had been working with previously. Previously, you'd had these thoroughbred Indy V8 racing engines, and now you're going to a pushrod stock
Yeah,
block engine based on a passenger car power plant. What were the adjustments like going from a thoroughbred engine to something like that?
there was no adjustment whatsoever because once you're up to speed, it's kind of the same thing. But the only thing that was really different was getting out of the pits because you just had so much lag. and there was such a big turbo on it. They needed a big turbo, a big snail, um, to get that thing, spooled up and going. So leaving the pits was the hardest, and that proved also in the race. I stalled it in the pits, and I went down the lap and never recovered from that. But we also had a lot of boost problems in the race. So you're allowed to run 55 inches of boost with the push rod engine, as opposed to the Cosworth and the Chevy Ilmores. They were running 45 inches. With that push rod engine, just like Penske used in 1994, you're allowed to use 55 inches. We had a problem with our pop-off valve, and the whole race I could never get more than 50 inches. So, and because of that, the gearing was wrong, and everything it affects everything, and I couldn't really race people.
Well, then you went back in 96. This is the first year that it was IRL, still USAC sanctioned, but that was an interesting situation because you had your first qualification, it was taken away on
Yeah,
the first day, and it put you in the position to be in a second day qualifier. And in spite of that, in spite of you not having a shot at the pole, you went out and you set the 1 and 4 lap qualifying records, which still stand to this day. Now,
yeah.
most car owners would go at this point, oh, let's just get it in the show. Let's just be safe, get it in, and then start working a race setup. But you went out and you got those records. What led up to that decision to do that? Because it was a historic
Well,
decision.
as you said, be safe. It was safe. It
Mm.
was safe running 237 and 238 in practice. The car was phenomenal. It was the best car that I ever had at the Speedway. Um, what contributed to those speeds was also we had new tarmac. The Speedway had just been repaved. Firestone had an amazing tire. Um, the rumble strips were taken away on the bottom of the racetrack, so we had more racetrack to run with on. And Tim Wardrop, my engineer, who also had engineered me in 1995 with Menard, and the car was phenomenal as far as handling was then as well. Um, in fact, when Treadway was putting together the team, I insisted, I said, I need Tim Wardrop to be my engineer. So if he needs to make X amount of money, you need to pay him because I want that guy because he's phenomenal. And so the car was amazing. And what really, looking back at that whole turn of events, was that on Saturday morning we went out for a 8:30 or 8 o'clock practice. And I always thought to myself later, years later, like, why did we even go out and practice at 8 o'clock in the morning? Because we knew Friday what we could do, which was a 238. Why did we even go out on Saturday morning? And what happened Saturday morning was that um, Johnny Parsons had a crash in turn 3. I was right behind it, and stuff flew off of his car into my radiator side pod, and it cooked the engine.
Mm.
So then we went back to the garage, and then they put a different engine in, and mistakes were made. I went out on the track to practice, and that engine cooked. So now they had to go to the backup car, which hastily they got ready for qualifying. I went out and did my run. I had a good run, which was good enough for second, but then we were disqualified because the car was too light. They didn't weigh it before we went out. So the 7 pounds of below the weight, they got kicked us out. And otherwise that record would have never happened,
Mm.
which to me wasn't important. I really was not about setting the records. I was about, getting the pole and running up front. So now all of a sudden now we're going to be second day qualifiers. I practiced in the morning Sunday, and the car was phenomenal, like it had been all week. And to do the 237 average laps on that qualifying run was easy for me to do. It was safe, it was solid, and we just did it. And the bonus was that we had the record, but we're starting 21st.
Mm. Yeah, that's one of those funny things about Indianapolis. You can be the fastest guy, but maybe not on the pole back then. It's
Yeah.
strange.
Yeah, like I wrote in my book, like, we had the fastest car. We probably should have won this race, but in the end, we came out completely empty-handed, like really nothing to show for it.
Mhm.
Not a pole position, not a race win. We have the track record, but
Yeah.
to me, that didn't count.
Well, you mentioned the book. I want to talk about that in just a second. Just before we go to that, we got to touch on your second win, which almost didn't happen because of a USAC miscue with 2 laps to go.
Yeah.
And it was under yellow, and most people would assume, given what was going on, the cleanup was going to take a while. So it looked like you would win under yellow. Fine, great. But then they turn on then they wave the white and green flag, 1 lap to go, and the yellow lights are still on around the track.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it was
so
terrible.
so what went through your head? I mean, you made the right call. You decided to go by the flag stand and not the lights. But must have been
Yeah,
incredible.
it's funny how experience will help you in these situations, because in 1990, when I was coming towards the white flag,
Mhm.
Emerson was passing me as we were going towards turn one, and I'm looking in my mirror to see, where's he going, and I just let him by because he was a lap down. But while I was doing that, I never saw the white flag.
Mm.
So then I came around and I see the jacket. I go, oh shoot, I never saw a white. 1997, go up 7 years. I'm saying to myself, I'm looking at that stand. I'm looking at it. I want to see the white flag. And I see the white flag and I see green, and I'm like, if you go to the Indy Car camera, you can actually see that I shift up a gear because I'm going to
Yeah.
cruise to the finish on the yellow. Now I had to scramble, get it down back to second gear. And I thought everybody's just going to pass me because I had no speed. But luckily for me, nobody expected a green flag. Scott
Mm.
Goodyear didn't expect it. Nobody behind him did. But I literally thought I was going to get passed by everybody going into one because I had no speed going. So I think that my experience of just wanting to see that white flag saved my butt.
Wow. Yeah. Given the perspective from the previous win. Yeah.
Yeah. And then talking about speed, which is really, this can maybe give our listeners an idea of what speed is all about. So the year before I could do 238 on my own. In 1997, I could do 218.19 on my own. So we're talking quite a spread here,
Mhm.
18 miles an hour difference. To drive 218 with that 97 car was way more difficult, way harder, and way more stressful than driving 237, 238 with the other car. So it's not always about the speed that you drive at Indy, which makes it either easier or less
Mhm.
hard. Um, if your car is not handling the way it should at Indy, you can scare yourself doing a 200-mile-an-hour lap.
Mhm.
If the car is phenomenal, you're just driving at ease doing 238. So it's not always. I always say, well, the speed is just a number. It's about what you feel in the car.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you have a book that is now out, and
Well, it's out in the
in,
you cannot get it in the States because
not
it's
yet.
only in the Netherlands, and it's in Dutch, but it will be in English, and we'll publish it early 2025.
Oh, excellent.
So yeah, I'm really excited. I worked so hard on that book, and how that came about was there's a magazine in the Netherlands called RTL GP magazine, and it's a magazine that is that focuses mainly on the history of Formula One and sports car racing, some Indy car. And so I've been writing columns for that magazine for the last 10 years.
Hmm.
So we had all these short stories put together that we go like, let's put it in a book form and then we'll add some more. And that's what we did. And it came out great.
That's great. Well, we'll definitely be looking for that in the early part of 2025, because it looks fantastic, and I'm sure the text is right up there with the pictures as well, because you've had a really, really interesting career. Thanks so much for being with us today to share some stories about it and provide
Yeah, it was
insights.
my pleasure.
Really happy
Absolutely.
about it. And we hope that you have well, at least you live out in Phoenix, so the seasons are a little bit different there. But we hope you have we hope you have a good rest of the year. We wish you continued success, and thank you for the work that you do as a steward in the Indy Car series. We really appreciate it.
We have. I don't know when you're going to broadcast the podcast, but we're going to be in Nashville this coming weekend, which is a title deciding race between Will Power and Alex Palou. It's going to be, it's hard to tell what will happen there because they haven't been there for the longest time. It's a concrete surface racetrack. We'll hope it's an exciting race and a safe race always.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you again very much. And for Arie and myself, this is Jason White saying so long, and we'll see you on our next podcast. Everyone, take care and be safe.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Arie.
Thank you.